Welcome to Thinking Deeply about Primary Education, the podcast that gives you a peek inside the minds of some truly inspirational teachers. This week, I'm thrilled to welcome back both Victoria Morris and Neil Almond onto the podcast, this time to talk about all things primary history. If you enjoyed their thoughts on primary geography, then you're going to love this one. So there's so much to take away that the hard part will be finding space for all of your notes. Before we get started, I'd once again like to ask for a small favour, because one of the ways to help ensure this podcast reaches the many teachers not using social media is to leave a review wherever you're listening. It should only take a second, and it would mean so much to know that these interviews were reaching those they can help. And as a thank you, one reviewer will be chosen at random during episode 8 of season 2 and receive signed copies of Thinking Deeply about Primary Mathematics, The Art and Science of Primary Reading, 100 Ideas for Primary Teachers, Maths, and the Research Aid Guide to Curriculum. But without further ado, let's spend some time thinking deeply about primary history education.
Excellent. So Neil and Victoria, it's good to have you back. Good to see you again.
Good to be back.
So I think we can just jump straight in now that we're all familiar with who everyone is and where we're coming from. So I think possibly the only thing that you guys are more passionate and knowledgeable about than geography is history at primary level. So tell me, why is it important at our phase of schooling?
So I just looked at the preamble to the national curriculum, and there's an explanation of why history is important in there. So it says about understanding the complexity of people's lives, the process of change, diversity of societies and relationships, as well as their own identity. So I think I'm not going to try and restate that. I think that's a good explanation of why it's important there.
Yeah, similar to Victoria, when I saw the question, I go back to the purpose of study in the national curriculum and all the reasons why history is important at primary level, are written down very well, I think, in that preamble. Again, going back to, as I said on the geography podcast, young children are quite egotistical. They find it difficult to see things beyond the self, and so I think history is important at primary because it makes them understand how we got to the point where we can actually focus on the self. Thinking particularly, the transition from nomadic hunter-gatherers, where we were kind of living to survive, and it was the all about the tribe and the group mentality, as opposed to now, when they started to develop agriculture and irrigation, we went that transition between living to survive to thriving, and being able to give the humanity that greatest commodity of all things, time, to focus on the self. And obviously through that, society improved as well. But I think it's particularly powerful for children understanding how it is that we're lucky that we can even think about the self and not thinking about the tribe. And maybe that's gone too far the other way, but that's an ethics debate, I think, for another time.
So I was kind of thinking, like, how is this different from compared to the geography for history? And I came up, I don't know what you think of it, Neil, but I came up with geography is basically like understanding how does the world work, what is it like, and how does it work, and then history is why.
Yeah, I love that distinction. That's really nice.
There's more of an element of story and imagination in history, whereas geography's process, isn't it?
Yeah.
More to do with imagination in history and developing curiosity and storytelling.
I just feel like geography process, it's a lot more kind of data heavy kind of subject, where our level of certainty is so much more sure as to how the continents are the way that they are right now. Obviously those things still change, but when it comes to history, teaching history as certainty, as fact, yes, there are some things that we can do, and obviously 200, 300 years from now, it'll be a lot easier because we've got little cameras to document all of this stuff. But a lot of it is interpretations of what little there actually is there. And so, as you say, imagination and that sense of uncertainty, I think, is an incredibly important difference between the two subjects as well.
It seems in my experience that history is probably the one that most teachers understand the importance of a little bit more than geography, say. And it's probably very close to the core subjects in terms of people's passion for it. Do you think that's because of the sense of narrative and the fact that people can relate to it, or do you think there are other factors that sort of give it that almost increased status among primary teachers?
I think the narrative's more obvious in history. Like, it's stories about people as well, isn't it? Like a specific person and their story, and maybe it's more obvious. I think there is a sense of narrative in geography, but it might not jump out at you in the same way that it has to be presented to you in a certain way for it to make sense, I guess.
Yeah, and I think it's just a more, I think, because it is fundamentally about people, it's just far more relatable, I think. Whereas, say geography is more those abstract processes, of erosion, which for some people it's neither here nor there. But thinking of Guy Fawkes is, everyone I think can compare themselves in a way of wanting a certain goal and finding a certain way of how to do it and all of that kind of thing.
If you guys had to condense your approach to history in a set of guiding principles, what would they be? And are there any marked differences to those we discussed in reference to geography?
For Key Stage 2, there isn't, for me, that much difference. Obviously, the curriculum itself is a little bit more, say a little bit more prescriptive. I don't mean prescriptive. There's more content. It gives you more content to cover than the geography curriculum, for example. So there's more to go on for there. So obviously, you look at the curriculum as a school, you need to decide where things go, and there needs to be logic behind those decisions. We don't give year 4 the Egyptians just because that's where it's always been. As I say, I think prior to the new Ofsted framework, the most political conversations I think that happened in the staff room was who would get to teach the Victorians or something like that, because those were, it must be in year 5 because that's where year 5 have always done it, which obviously is not a great reason for doing things. So definitely curriculum, decide on the outcome. For Key Stage 2, you want to link appropriately to the second order concepts of history. Quite fortunate in that historians, there's a greater consensus as to what constitutes history. So the things like evident significance, change in continuity, similarity and difference, we're quite kind of, as a subject discipline, they're quite content. These are the things that we look at when we do our subjects. Again, you're mapping out that sequence, find that endpoint, decide what that's going to look like. You want to link then to the substantive concepts, so things like monarchy, empire, peasantry, all of those things that you can kind of sprinkle in as many units as possible, because those are the nice links and the nice threads that you can get between different units across year groups or within the same year group. And where possible, that's where you can get your meaningful cross-curricular stuff done. Trade, for example, is a really great one that transcends history, and it lends itself so beautifully as well to geography. So there's that natural link there as to how all that was able to happen. And then, as I say, and then you write version 1 and you walk away from it, you come back to it and make any changes. You live it, you teach it, you change, you reflect on it, and you change it. For Key Stage 1, and this is going back to something that I kind of mentioned in when we did the quiz edition. I don't know if maybe Victoria actually knows that this is where my thinking is going, but I think I would, if I was an academy and I had kind of complete curriculum control and I used those the powers that the government give me, I would actually get rid of the history requirements for Key Stage 1, and I would make it all about story, narrative. And so actually I would use that as a tool for my literacy writing. I'd find, it's time for a read aloud, right? Okay, we're going to read a historical non-fiction text, maybe from the Core Knowledge website, about the Aztecs or whatever it might be. And so actually throughout year 1 and year 2, they're hearing just lots and lots of different stories about different periods of history, and not necessarily going into the depth that the national curriculum kind of puts them in straight away, which I think there are merits to it, absolutely. But I think, again, if I had full creative control, I think that's the way that I would quite like to look at it.
It was interesting because I've written down like there's more of a choice than history, because you said you feel like history's more, did you say history's more like what word is it, fixed?
Yeah, there's more content to cover, I feel like, in the history curriculum than the geography curriculum.
Yeah, I think there's more breadth of content, but then I feel like the geography is more concrete. Like it tells you, teach them about these things. And obviously there's different contexts you can use for it, but like the history, there's a lot more choice, isn't there? So making the right choices is maybe more important, planning the history curriculum, than geography is more choosing the places that you're going to focus on to teach certain things through. And I think the difference in the history, the geography, it's more you're either going to teach about a process or you're teaching about a particular place, isn't it, on the whole? History, you've got that thing of deciding, do you teach it as an overview or a depth study, like what overviews do you do and where do you make the depth studies? There's a lot more sort of freedom to choose where you do that, rather than the geography. You get told what places to do on the whole, don't you? And there's choices to make in between that. Like you choose which exact place in Europe, but you have to pick a region in Europe. So I think probably maybe the history, I don't know, is it harder to pin down exactly what you're going to do? I just felt like when I was thinking about it, it's harder to say for the history than the geography. It's like, teach this.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I think that's probably my
Is that what you were saying?
Yeah, I don't like to use this about myself. Maybe my expert blindness coming in a little bit there to choices, because you can get, it just says like the Romans and it gives you some non-statutory guidance as to what to do, but okay, it says the Romans in Britain as well, so you've only got about 500 years to play with, but choosing 500 years to do in however long you decide to give yourself for that is quite a task if you then don't know anything much about the Romans. Hence why you could then get people making Roman shields and calling that history, which I'm sure we'll go on to later on.
It's gonna go, we're going to get into that.
Do you reckon, because at the minute, there's quite a big conversation around what history, because obviously we've got the traditional Western chronology. Do you guys find it more difficult because of that changing landscape, or this is just my perception from outside, that actually if I were choosing content right now, I'd be a bit worried? Does that come into play at all, or is that just me being overthinking things?
It depends how it's done. Now, obviously, we do have a national curriculum, and if you're a LA school, you have to teach the national curriculum. There's no way about it, and that is quite heavy on the history of the British Isles and kind of typical Western civilization. There are choices that you can make within there that kind of does get that diversity of approaches and the different regions. Thinking specifically, you have the choice to do the Kingdom of Benin, for example, which was an African empire. So you can make the choice to do that. I think it's one you need to be careful of. And I think my, when I've asked and I've kind of helped schools about this, before we make it too tokenistic, I always say, right, let's have a look at what we have here and what we need to do, and how we're making sure that we're being representative in that. So case in point is the Romans. If you're doing some lessons, obviously we only have to focus on Romans in Britain, but it makes sense, I think, to do a couple of lessons about the Roman Empire and how it all came to be, and the Roman army, for example. If you're only showing pictures of the Roman army as white men, that's problematic because the Roman Empire spanned into North Africa, and one of the things that you could earn Roman citizenship by joining the Roman army. I think it was after 17 years, then you got your citizenship. So there were plenty of people of North African origin in the Roman army, and I think getting that across is incredibly important, and I think gives it that diversification without it necessarily appearing too tokenistic. And I think we do need to, I agree in teaching history really, really well, and that means, warts and all. So if you're only telling yourself, if you're only giving the benefits of the British Empire, then that is obviously problematic, and you need to discuss those other what people would say, the atrocities of the empire, and quite rightly so.
I think it's probably a subject knowledge issue, isn't it? That you have to have really, really strong subject knowledge to know where it's appropriate to, what's appropriate to include where, basically. I always used to think my history subject knowledge was quite strong, but actually it really isn't. I couldn't have given that example that you just gave. I'd have to do a lot more research myself to be able to address that properly, I think.
Yeah, I think because another one clear example is World War II and India. They came to our rescue, and then there's loads of information. There's loads, I think, in the Imperial War Museum. There's whole displays, there's whole pages of information on the website about the contribution of India, and particularly Sikhs as well, to the war efforts. And obviously, then I don't think you can teach the world wars well if you don't mention that, and then also go into it as a result of them, and their assistance. Independence followed several years afterwards. So, as I say, I think the main place to start is think about what you're teaching and where you can get that diversity where it's so thoroughly deserved.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right, Victoria, in terms of the limitations of our subject knowledge. No one's going to set out to give a sort of diminished or restricted view of history. But I think, when your historical understanding is the product of your own education, it's very easy for the sort of cycle to continue. And I suppose, in your opinion, what's the single most important aspect of history education?
That was quite a tricky question, actually. I thought I went for achieving a sense of a coherent narrative across the whole school. But I'm just going to repeat what I mean. I'm just going to explain the same thing again. Coming up with over the child's journey through the school, making sure that they've got that sense of a coherent narrative across all the units they've studied.
So when you sit down, and we may be jumping ahead to the curriculum later on, and you've got your blank page in front of you, what is it that helps you guide that narrative? Where do you start when you're trying to pinpoint those important points on the journey?
Me, I guess it's logic. It's just thinking what makes sense coming before, based on what came before and what's coming after, and making sure that you really think about what's come before when you plan what you're going to teach next, and just really having those links with prior learning, making it explicit so that the teacher's always referring to what they learnt and how it links, and just really having that thorough knowledge of what the child already knows.
Yeah, I think I agree with Victoria. I think that sense of chronology is quite important. I think teaching dates, I think there is a place for that, absolutely. But if they leave primary school kind of understanding, oh, okay, right, so we started the Stone Age, then we went to Iron, then we went to Bronze, and then it was the Romans, and then we had that kind of same time the Vikings and the Anglo-Saxons, and then they went away. They didn't go away, and then 1066, and then the Normans started, and all of that, and then obviously there's a natural massive break for whatever reason in our kind of chronology of how we teach the history, but then also understanding, right, well, ancient Greece kind of fits in, and that was happening at the same time at around this time, and that's why those ideas are kind of all going around at the same time. And so they get that sense of chronology, and when kind of these civilizations started to appear, I think that kind of puts them on a decent standpoint then for when they go into secondary school. But I think also understanding understanding really what history is, and history isn't just facts about the past, although facts are important to understanding history. It is, they understand, it's asking those kind of big and answering those kind of big questions, how has this changed, or how has the impact of this particular policy or event changed or continued a certain aspect or of life, or how was farming and agriculture similar but also different in the civilizations that cropped up near rivers and things like that. So understanding what it is a historian does, and having a sense of a chronology of kind of the big civilizations and the periods of English history or British history, I think is pretty important.
Just going back to the narrative as well, I'm thinking, like, if you've learnt about significant figures, and maybe not just in history but other subjects as well, actually understanding where do they fit in the chronology of what's being taught. So I've ended up doing, just incidentally with my class, because we were listening to music and like trying to fit the composers in with other people that they've learnt about in history, and that they know actually when that person wrote that bit of music, this was happening at the same time. So my class have learned about Florence Nightingale and Mary Seacole. So we've linked everything back to at what point in Florence Nightingale or Mary Seacole's life was this piece of music written, and this one, and the order. And my class last year were really good at ordering various composers and Florence Nightingale, Mary Seacole, and like things around the Victorian period, because we kept coming up to, and authors as well. We do poetry assemblies and reciting poems, and so they do Wordsworth. So I was trying to sort of link in like the classic poetry, when was that written, and sort of slot it in with some of the music we listened to and things, and some of the books we were reading as well were like more classic texts. So The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe, Wind in the Willows, just like when were they written, and they got quite hooked on actually where does this fit in this sequence of all the different authors and composers and poets that we had, and linking it back to their history. Because I think there's a danger of them just seeing this figure as some sort of, it's just in a void, isn't it, that they've got nothing to link it into. And if you can get them to have that sort of coherent understanding of how does everything fit together, that's probably for me, that's like the important thing, is not just seeing things as, oh, we've learned a bit about that and a bit about that, and they've got these sort of separate blobs of stuff.
That's on another level. Have you blogged about that or written about that?
I don't know if I've written about that specific thing, no.
I reckon you definitely should, because you've almost got this panorama then, don't you? Of yeah, and I'm really loving the idea of connecting those musicians, and they're, because I've got a sketchy outline of maybe the last 300 years of classical music in my head, but it takes a lot of reading to get actually somewhere near what the reality is. There's a big chunk that I think, from Mozart to like Mahler is a lot closer in my head than it is in real life and stuff. And I think that's something of immense value. And if I think I reckon if Neil threw in a diagram and you threw in the words, that'd be the ultimate blog.
It used to amaze me when I threw the names up. I used to keep a list and add names to it, and I used to just throw the names up on the board, and they could actually correctly put them in chronological order. Like whenever I came back to it, they could still do it. And I know that's just like a retrieval. It's not like an in-depth understanding, but they did genuinely understand the sequencing of when those things link together.
I think that's really useful, because whenever I read anything, so I enjoy reading around history. So I'm reading, Hamilton's biography, and it's just a useful thing to know. Around this time, these things were happening.
Yeah.
I was reading something about Mozart yesterday, and to be honest, I don't really know much about classical composers at all, but there was a date in there that I could easily associate with, 1776. All right, so we're around the time of American independence and all of that starting, and it just kind of, as I say, it anchors what you're learning about and kind of stops it from being out in the ether and something else is just out there. And it's like, okay, I can kind of see how this kind of mental timeline that I'm kind of building up, how that all comes together, which I think is, really powerful.
Yeah, I've benefited in a few quizzes when they've asked about Napoleon and certain things happening, and then I've obviously got this mental hook of the 1812 overture, and I'm all okay. It's not going to be very far from that, and then you get within 10 years, and haha, then get the points. That's awesome. And what is it that schools who provide a really stellar history offering do so well?
So I think there is that narrative, there is that coherence between all the units that are there, and I think it's not easy to do. I think it's easier to do that for history than it might be for geography, but that might just be a subject knowledge deficit. So it's really kind of easy, I think. And once you start looking at the civilizations that you have to teach, you can see all of those, really strong links that appear already. Things like that moving from an agricultural society to an agricultural society. It's such a massive leap in human development and how we got here. And it's kind of interesting to notice, so that most of the ancient civilizations were near rivers. Okay, so why was that? Oh, because they developed irrigation. Why did they develop irrigation? Oh, because they could start farming. Why did they farm? Because they didn't have to spend all their time out hunting and gathering their food, which meant that they had time to do interesting things. And once you kind of get that and you see those similarities, you see Greece and go, actually, Greece wasn't exactly like that. They had some farming, but it was more to do with trade because they were right on the Mediterranean. So they had, plenty of fish, and they'd go and trade to various other countries within the Mediterranean as well. So I think it's quite an easy one to find those natural links and hooks. And it's one of those ones where if you have a knowledge explicit curriculum, it's easier for that year 3 teacher to go, oh, right, okay, well, that's why you're making me teach about trade, because we're then going to understand that when we're doing the Egyptians, Hatshepsut's trade mission down the Red Sea was really important, because then we can contrast that with when the Romans came over to Britain and opened up, trade with the whole empire, and how the building of roads made trade so much easier, which meant that we started getting, more things. And you can go back and you can get very nerdy about, the Beaker people and how trade started there, and how actually we were quite an egalitarian society until these people came around and said, we have this skill that none of you guys have. What are you going to give us for it? And how then, capitalism, started to take over, and here we are today. So I think it's quite, if you have the subject knowledge and you are nerdy enough like me, I think it's quite an easy one to make all of those links to. I think they focus on that chronology, so they make sure that chronology is there. And linking back to what Victoria said with the composers and bringing in other aspects as well, there's a great company, I think they're called Timeline for Schools, and if you have a long wall, they will just put a timeline of whatever you want. You can go for as long as you want. So if you have a really kind of knowledge explicit curriculum where I'm going to be in music, you're going to learn about Mozart and Williams, whoever it is that you might want to do, they can incorporate that onto that timeline. So it's there in front of the kids, and as you're going past on assembly, you can say, right, let's quick little bit of retrieval practice, kids, as we're on the way, make use of all those kind of learning opportunities. And because it's set, it makes it easier, I think, for teachers to get on board and the students as well, because you know what to expect.
Things like trade and, as you've said, our switch from a nomadic people to an agrarian people. Are those features that highly effective schools will always include, or do they have a range of choice in terms of the sort of the big concepts and the big picture they want to portray?
I think there is a choice, but at the same time, and perhaps your definition of what you think civilization, society is might impact that choice. But I think we'll kind of all agree, or I think there will probably be some sort of an agreement that unless you've developed an effective writing system, you're probably not quite there at the point of civilization. And so obviously that's a wonderful thing to look at from a Sumerian cuneiform, and how they started off and how that changed through hieroglyphics and various other logographs, and the rebus principle, and how we started to stop using symbology for things because it got a bit confusing and we don't have enough space and our mental capacity to remember all these symbols until we get to some sort of Greek, Latin alphabet. So I think there are, for me personally, I think there are a core few that I think we can all agree on, that a civilization will have these things, but then there are certainly other ones that scholars regularly argue over, and I think being in tune with what they're saying. And I actually think it's probably less is more when it comes to that thing. I think I'd rather 4 or 5 concepts that do kind of look into all of those civilizations, that students can come to the end of their schooling and be like, right, I understand the importance of trade. I understand the importance of literacy and writing systems and the use of tools, because that enabled us to do all that, enabled this society to do, this civilization to do ABC, it enabled that society to do ABC. This one didn't have it. They relied on someone else for it. And so actually then this happened. So yeah, I think less is more on that.
That makes a lot of sense. So it's driven by your definition of civilization, and then you run from there. Yeah.
So I was thinking inquiry, and I guess that goes back to the whole making things coherent as well, that really letting inquiry drive your unit, so you're not just teaching a lot of disconnected facts, that you've got that sort of inquiry and really thinking about inquiry questions, which is quite hard. You're not just picking a question for the sake of it, but like having really good purposeful inquiries would be something that probably a mark of the better history curriculum. And making sure it's led by those concepts that are in the preamble to the national curriculum. Right, again, that you're not just teaching some facts about it, but you really understand those sort of different concepts, and you're using them to drive the questions. And also like looking at the coverage and the breadth and depth of the curriculum, that again, you haven't just selected something to meet each bullet point on the national curriculum, but why have you made where there are choices? Why have you chosen that particular thing? And that there's a really good reasoning behind the choices that have been made. I'm just finding it really interesting how comparing what Neil's response is to mine on this one. I feel like my knowledge of, I think I've got much more of a narrow knowledge of history. It's so interesting seeing the difference between the way I approach it, because I don't think I really understood those concepts until quite recently, to be honest. I thought I'd always been quite good at history and done quite a lot of history at school, and I hadn't really got that. It's only listening to a lot of research ed talks and people speaking, and Christine Council mentions her history examples, and I'm like, oh my goodness, that's another one I didn't know, like write that down, research that. I think that's probably a mark of the better history curriculum, is if you really have that understanding of those historical concepts, because otherwise it is just, this was an interesting period in history, here's some things that happened, and that's it, and there's no sort of purpose behind it.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the reasons why it was absolutely essential that both of you were answering at the same time, because there are lots of ways to come at it, but actually you're both thinking really, really deeply about similar ideas but almost with different outcomes at the same time, you know. Yeah, so, and you know, personally, I think I liked, you know, I really like history. But did I go half as far as you guys are discussing? Probably not. So it absolutely fascinates me listening, thinking, oh yeah, this sounds absolutely wonderful. You know, I'd love to be a kid in one of those classes, never mind a teacher. And so, are the pitfalls, again, like geography, sort of the opposite, or is there anything that schools should aim to avoid in terms of their provision of history education?
The pitfalls are similar to geography, isn't it? Make sure you're actually teaching history in the history lessons. You're not just doing some fun activities linked to that period of history. You're not just writing something set in that period, but what you're teaching is actually history. And also about covering the national curriculum and making sure what you teach, like Neil said earlier, you don't just teach something about the Romans, but look at what it actually asks you to teach about the Romans in the national curriculum. And yeah, there are choices about how you can do that, but you can't just do a few things on mosaics and Roman villas and the army. That doesn't cover what it says about Roman Britain in the national curriculum. So like really referring back to that. So trying to sort of superficially say, oh yeah, we've done something on the Romans, we've done something on the Egyptians, we've done something, like that's going to be the things to avoid. It's just try and really make sure it's all linked back to exactly what it says in the national curriculum. And the same thing as well, I think, about going too much into opinions or value judgments on was this right? Was the person right to do this and that kind of thing? It's not really, that takes it too much into citizenship and PSHE. It's not really about judging what happened. It's about looking at why and learning about what did happen and people's viewpoints on it. But it's not about the children giving their opinion of whether someone was right to do something. So I wrote what I've got is pretty similar to the geography.
Certainly some similarities, like not just facts about the past. Your history doesn't come from a topic title, and your topic title also isn't a ridiculously silly thing that's borrowed from horrible histories, because I think that the level of, the poor Vikings, with having, vicious Vikings, given to them for so long, where, there was quite substantial amount of evidence that they weren't, they were, don't get me wrong, they did some very vicious things, but to, make such a massive generalization, I think is not helpful with those things. But I think there are a few other things I was thinking about that are kind of history specific. One of them links from what kind of Victoria said about making sure it doesn't turn into a values or ethics class, and kind of linked from that, it's the kind of tasks that we can sometimes be asking children to do. It is not appropriate, I think, to ask a Year 5 child to imagine that they are a slave on a slave ship and write a diary entry as if they were, part of the Atlantic Triangle and they were, going on a journey from that. It's not appropriate. I'm a bit of a stickler for this one, but I think writing in role in history is a bit of a no-go for me, and it's not something I would personally advocate because of the misconceptions that it can provide. Your average Roman soldier probably couldn't write, and if he could write, he's unlikely to be writing a diary entry. There were some, so I'm saying there might be some space for it. Certainly, the Vindolanda scrolls, for example, are a letter from someone who was on the wall, Hadrian's Wall, writing back to Rome. So if you were looking at that specific person, fine, but to do it as a kind of generic, and now imagine you've crossed, into Scotland as a Roman soldier and now write back, I don't necessarily think it's appropriate. And kind of my last one I would avoid is, I just wrote this down very quickly and I kind of don't know if it's an official title for what it's called, but like an artifact first approach, where you think, oh, I have an amazing artifact here. And I'm going to kind of give children the time to explore that, and the history will kind of come from that. I think we need to do it the other way around, where actually the artifact is used to strengthen our historic argument, not as a starting point for history. So those would kind of be my no-goes, I think.
The point as well, actually, about trips. If you're going to go on a trip, it's actually often more useful to go on the trip towards the end of the topic, and the children know things about it already. And same with artifacts, actually, because I've been on a museum trip before where they were showing artifacts and asking the children to work out what they were. I mean, I didn't have a clue what they were, so that it's not really helpful to do that. If you don't have sufficient knowledge, you can't work out what the things were for, or you work out something that actually turns out to be wrong. So it's actually better to have, if you've taught the children about those specific objects before, and then you show them the real thing, they can recognize it and link it to what they've learned. But just giving a child an artifact and asking them to work out what it is, it's not, you're just going to waste a lot of time getting a lot of wrong guesses, I think.
Yeah, I think it's the same for anyone. The more you know about something, the more you appreciate it. Yeah, so I think you've hit the nail on the head. And I'm sure everyone's got children to write and roll at some point in their careers. But the argument against it is pretty strong, and particularly the examples you've given, Neil. It doesn't make any sense at all, really, especially when there's so much rich history to teach. Spending time that we don't have necessarily in a literacy lesson, and a poorly advised literacy lesson is, I now can't see any way that I could justify it at all.
It's actually incredibly hard to write accurately about the past. It's so hard. There's so many details that I'm sure I have got children to do that in the past. And when I've done it, you then sort of get bogged down in, as they're writing, they're asking you about all these little details, or you read it and you realise they've put some totally historically accurate thing in there because they just don't know the amount of detail needed to do it properly. I just don't think that children can really have, they can't have the depth of knowledge of what it was like at that time. So, I mean, it can be quite useful to explore, would they have had this or not? But actually getting them to write it, you're going to end up getting a lot of pieces of writing it's just not really accurate either.
Yeah, and I think that leads back to kind of the change that I think is maybe slowly happening, which is where the foundation subjects were traditionally just seen as a way to get more extended writing from the English side of things. So whereas we weren't too fussed whether someone was writing the story of Remus and Romulus, but they then took out their iPad as long as they were using the right the literacy, the writing features that we wanted were in there, and so we could go to a moderator and be like, well, look, they're using so they got their subordinate clause with an omitted relative pronoun in there. So and I think the content of the subject has to come first for me.
I think I actually have had this written down for the previous question. I didn't say it. I think you can get really high quality writing from history, but it's just about the choice of task, isn't it? Yeah. So you can get really good writing evidence in year 6 from your history if you're writing an essay at the end of your topic, and it's like non-fiction, writing a comparison. When I was in year 6, I used to do a lot of comparison writing, actually probably based on comparing books, but it would work in history as well. And it used to be some of the best evidence that I had that wasn't actually written as a piece of writing. It was actually based on something else. But just then, if you've got the comparison, then there's opportunities for really good sentence structures and conjunctions and all those features that you're looking for, that you can get evidence of those things. And it's actually a purposeful piece of non-fiction writing is actually often better than those sort of writing in role type tasks anyway. So if you want narrative evidence, it's better to just focus on writing a really good story. And then the writing you get through the history, make it non-fiction writing using the content that they've learned, then that's a really great way of getting writing.
Distinction, isn't it, between you're writing about history versus writing stories within a historical period. Like, there are some great stories that are written in, based on a historical period, and it's actually us being able to work out, the accuracies versus the authorial kind of flair that certain authors use to make their stories worthwhile.
Yeah, I saw Andrew Percival talking about his school doing essay writing on Twitter recently, and I thought, and that's all. This is a direction I want to know more about. And so just as you guys are talking about that, I'm thinking, that makes a whole lot of sense. And like I think I've said before, I'm lucky enough to work with Jack Harker and see his planning process in history, and he has to cut a whole lot of what he wants to include in his Romans. Like he does this wonderful sequence where he goes from Celtic Britain to the Romans over the cross of maybe the first 14 weeks of the 16 weeks of the year. And if he doesn't have enough time for half the stuff he wants to have in there. If he were to spend his time doing writing lessons at the same time, those children wouldn't be given as high quality an opportunity as they do at the minute. So I totally see where you're coming from.
So when we do essays, we allocate a bit of time in our English lessons to write the essay after they've finished the history learning. And I think people hear the word essay and think it's some sort of boring, dry. Children actually love writing essays. Like my class are excited about writing the essay. They really want to write it. And we got interrupted from writing one last year because of lockdown. And they were so upset that because they know that they know the knowledge and they just really want to be able to do that piece of writing. They're so proud of themselves because they've got so much to say. I think it is, if you can, you don't have to call it essays, but if you can do something similar to that and really allocate that literacy time so you get really good quality writing, you're using what they know, the children really love that.
It's a beautiful form as well, because I'm thinking about conversations I've had with Neil about the Ascent of Man and how it's essentially essay as TV, where he's done, quite a few, consecutive essays and they build up over time and stuff. And I think it's not only is a really useful skill, but it's a really good form of expression in terms of, like you say, with history being about the why, you can express what you think the why is and stuff. Yeah. So that's really clear. So if anyone wants to improve their teaching of history, where are they going to? I think obviously your blogs are probably the best starting point. Where are they going to sort of develop their knowledge of their craft in this respect?
Shall I go? So I think for me, it was quite a difficult one because there are so many places where you can go. So obviously, and I'll talk about these later on. There is the History Association for primary, which I think is particularly good. There's a particular paper that I really like, and I think it goes back to that idea of how sources is done in primary schools. So it's called Primary Sources in History, Breaking Through the Myths, and it's written by someone called Keith Barton, who's, I think he's Australian, and he's a history educator out there, and he kind of goes through actually in what is elementary schools out there. These are some bad uses of primary sources. And I think for teachers who aren't well versed, we're not historians, we're not professional historians, we don't necessarily know how to do these things properly, and we're not taught these things, and it's not something that we should, we're expected to know. But I think it's a kind of he provides a useful list of kind of do's and don'ts as to how we might kind of simplify this. And I know if you talk to secondary school teachers on Twitter, they'll actually tell us don't do any source work, because actually the amount of misconceptions that we kind of inadvertently provide with regards to sourcing takes them a lot of time to unpick and sort out later on. So I kind of think if there was one paper kind of just on history I'd want people to read, it would be this one, Breaking Through the Myths of Primary Sources in History. Just very quickly, he just outlines kind of the 7 myths that there are, which are primary sources are more reliable than secondary sources. Myth 2, primary sources can be read as arguments about the past. Myth 3, historians use a sourcing heuristic to evaluate bias and reliability, which I know is the big one that the secondary school teachers really kind of get upset about, because we always go, oh, who wrote it? Goebbels, so therefore it must be biased. It's like, well, it's not quite as simple as that. Myth 4, using primary sources engages students in authentic historical inquiry. So that again kind of goes back to what I said, some bad history curricula might do is they use that primary source as a way to think, oh, right, you're being an historian now, which I think does more damage than good. Myth 5 was that students can build up an understanding of the past just through primary sources. And myth 6, sorry, there's only 6 of them. Sources can be classified as primary or secondary, and he kind of looks very kind of carefully at what that means and how it all depends whether, what the inquiry question might be will depend whether a source is primary or secondary, depending on the role that inquiry question takes. Quite usefully then, he then provides a list of some things that sources can be used for, which is to motivate historical inquiry, to supply evidence for historical accounts, to convey information about the past, and to provide insights into the thoughts and experiences of people in the past. So I kind of think if you are a history coordinator, I think it's good to kind of, Martin Luther and his nailing of the 95 Theses, that's what you're going to nail up in front in the classrooms of all your teachers.
So as well as what Neil said, I think, like for me, if you can listen to Christine Council speak at all, because she always weaves in historical examples, even if the topic of the talk's something else, even if it's not like a specifically history focused talk. So the level and the depth of what she describes just always blows my mind. I'm always thinking, oh my goodness, I didn't know any of this. I need to read everything I can about that now. So, and just, he's fantastic speaking about the curriculum in general, but for ideas about, and I think she comes at it maybe a different way because she's secondary based. When I've heard her talking about what she's doing with the primary curriculum and the ancient civilizations, that's really changed my way of thinking about it. I don't think I had a very joined up way of looking at the ancient civilizations before. So listening to Christine Council speak about anything would be great. And I've had recommended to me, in the geography podcast, I mentioned the Teaching Primary Geography book, which I have read. I haven't actually got the history version, but I have had it recommended to me that's quite good as well. So that would be a good book to get. I'm definitely going to get that one. I think just lots of discussion on Twitter. I learn loads from discussing on Twitter. Yeah, I think just I realise I'm wrong when someone else starts saying, oh, I can't believe they're doing this. And I think, oh, I didn't know you weren't supposed to. So I just think it's having as much dialogue as you can, which is probably the case for any subject, isn't it? Just trying to learn about things and then talking to people and realising because it's the same thing we said in geography, you don't know what you don't know sometimes to research it, do you?
And you think then when you think you know it is the worst moment, because that's the point where you need to be thinking, there's definitely more to this somewhere.
Yeah, that's why Christine Council always makes me think, oh my goodness, I've got so much more to learn about this. I wouldn't be able to start feeling, what's the word? I wouldn't be able to start developing any sort of arrogance about having mastered curriculum development, because any time I listen to her, I'm thinking, oh my goodness, in my whole lifetime I couldn't get to this level. It's motivating listening to someone who's got that sort of depth of knowledge, I think.
Is hers the opening chapter in the Research Ed curriculum book, Guide to Curriculum?
No, she closes it.
Closes it. I knew she had one in there. Yeah, I remember it being really interesting and really powerful. And I think she speaks quite a lot at Red, and some of the sort of more, it's bred like Cleethorpes and that kind of thing. I can't think she was speaking there recently, so I think there are quite often lots of opportunities to hear her speak. But the method of use of Twitter sounds like a really healthy, but not necessarily a common usage, where you're listening to other people's ideas, taking them on board and refining your practice. And sometimes it feels as if the default is to, transmit rather than receive. And I think as you describe the use of Twitter, that's definitely how to get the most out of it.
Yeah, I think we have some great history-based discussions on. It's often a lot of debate. I think we often get Michael Tidd involved and Tiffany, and we can have these whole long discussions, and it's always very pleasant. That's like my favourite thing about Twitter. I love that. That's just a nice discussion about reasons and everyone listening to everyone else.
And what about subject knowledge? What are your top 3 sources of rich historical knowledge?
It's taken me a long time to get my head around actually getting the words out today for some reason. No, I think for me, probably the main thing that I've always done is visiting like historic buildings and museums and things like that. Maybe that's why my history subject knowledge isn't great, because then I'm just getting a snapshot of all the local stuff. I don't know like anything that's interesting near wherever I'm on holiday. That's what I'm going to find out about. So, and definitely, I think same as with the geography, like knowledge of local history in the area is quite important for selecting those local history studies. So I think visiting all the museums and all the National Trust places in the area, that's going to be good. And I think when I visit places, I'm always thinking about, I just read all the information and I'm thinking about how does it link to the curriculum. So that for me, that's one of the main things. I don't know, it just makes me want to learn more. That's one of the main things I do. And reading children's books again, I read because it's more accessible, isn't it? Like in an ideal world, you might read all of the adult versions of but time-wise, you can't necessarily do that. So like, if you're struggling for time, finding, I love the DK eyewitness books, just really reading those and thinking before starting to plan something. That's probably the main things that I do. And actually, I was going to say something about Twitter as well. Another thing on Twitter that's really good for history is if you follow history-specific hashtags or accounts on Twitter, because there's things like Hill Fort Wednesday, and it's just interesting anyway, actually. I love that. And I follow lots of Romans accounts now, and I get all the stuff about they've discovered new mosaics, and there's just lots of interesting news articles if you start following some history stuff on there. If they discover, and that can be quite good to then use in the curriculum if there's been a new discovery and it links to what you're teaching as well. So it's worth looking at. I don't know how much it is for. I've mainly done it for Romans and prehistory. There's definitely lots of good stuff to follow on those topics.
Nice. Where would you go to, Neil? Or what are your 3 sources of rich historical knowledge?
Cutting it down to 3 was difficult, so I'm going to not give you 3. I'm going to give you more. First of all, You're Dead to Me podcast with Greg Jenner is really, really good. There's Greg, a professional historian and a comedian as well. So it's quite lighthearted, but you can get a lot out of it, and some really interesting stuff on there. And quite a few episodes are quite easy to relate to the national curriculum as well. So that's a great way to go, particularly for UK history and the history of like the British Isles. If you YouTube a channel called 10-Minute Histories, it kind of goes through certain periods or certain events in 10 minutes. And I think I have spent a whole day just, that autoplay button was on, and before you know it, we had got up to something that resembled something relatively modern day. Victoria made me think of this one actually when she mentioned Michael Tidd. If you Google Michael Tidd cheat sheets when the when the 2014 curriculum was going in its infancy. He produced these, which are kind of a rough springboard starting point for where you want to go. I've mentioned the History Association. I checked the pricing on this one. It's £72 a year for a primary school on that. They've got some really good podcasts. They've got the primary magazine is really, really useful. Plenty of articles in there. And in the geography episode, I talked about how some things can be behind the secondary paywall, and I think a few primary colleagues who are as enthusiastic, shall we say, about primary history, particularly doing it well at Key Stage 2. We threw up a bit of a fuss about all the What's the Wisdom podcasts and series being behind the secondary paywall. So they very kindly enabled those. They opened those up to those with the primary subscription as well. For those that are not sure, the What's the Wisdom really looks at what those second order concepts of history are. So when we're talking about evidence, change and continuity, if you're not sure what those are, there's articles about them, and there are podcasts with Christine Council there. Just get yourself a membership. That's really, really good. And then links to what Victoria said. I use the news app on my iPhone, and every now and then, and you can search for categories that you're interested in. So obviously I've got a lot of history 1. So in my saved folder, I have article about various things to do with history that relates to the curriculum and relates to aspects of the history that my trust teaches. And so I kind of keep those, and I will screenshot them, print them out, and either read them, or kids can access them as well. And kind of an area of assessment that I'm kind of interested in when we look at history and how we can assess these kind of foundation subjects is kind of that really simple before and after. What do you understand about this article that appears in the it's in a newspaper? It's not necessarily a history magazine, but I know there's been quite a lot of talk about Stonehenge recently, and how perhaps that it was moved from Wales to where it is now. So I've got a few articles about that. So actually, right, if I've taught you Iron Age to Stone Age, sorry, wrong way around, Stone Age through to the Iron Age, and I've now given you this newspaper article to read, I'd like to think that your depth of understanding and the connections perhaps you're making from that is far more fruitful than it was before I taught you about that. So I think there's quite a nice way you can look at assessment through that as well.
I think what's really interesting is that whenever I wrote that question, none of the sources, well, I suppose aside from the Historical Association, were ones that I would have thought of. So I think that's going to be really useful, because I think you've got some really unique and inspirational sort of sources of your own inspiration there. So I think that's really useful. And I think that in our discussion of what schools do really well, the features of a high quality curriculum came across, because they're essentially a large part of what they do really well. So, you okay if I move on to the next question? So in smaller schools who might not necessarily have the capacity or the time enjoyed by their larger counterparts, what can they do with regards to curriculum design?
I said, sorry, Victoria.
Okay. But I mean, I can say what we did in my school, which is a 1-form entry, to create our curriculum. So basically, we just gave over, and this is the later phase. I wasn't involved in the early phase. So when I joined the school, there'd already been a lot of work going on beforehand. But when I joined, we were just in the process of creating our sort of curriculum overview that was explicit about the knowledge we were teaching in each unit. And so the way that we did that was to give over quite a lot of staff meeting time and a couple of inset days to letting teachers who had already taught those units summarise what did they teach. And I think it's good to start with teachers who have already taught it, because you just have more depth of knowledge if you've had to teach it, rather than one person having to come at it and research all of that. If the teachers do this, like the initial sort of write was by the teachers, and then for each subject, one person, like the subject lead, then took all of the plans for each year group, looked at the units and fitted them together, and then maybe adapted them a little bit if they weren't as coherent as they could have been, adjusted some of the content, or I just checked it. Is it as closely linked to the national curriculum as possible? So I did the history and geography. So I adjusted it a little bit, but it was mainly what the teachers had written. And then looked at the links between the units as well. So we managed to do that in one academic year. And that's as a small staff. And I think I maybe had I might have had 1 or 2 days out of class to do it. So I think it is doable for a small school to do something like that, with all the teachers working together, and then one person sort of overseeing their subject.
Nice. I think that's really powerful, because you're not speaking hypothetically, you're speaking to your own experience. And you've been very, very both careful and smart with your time there, and utilized your team, which I'm 100% behind, the experience of our more wizened colleagues, 100%. So I think that'll be really useful. Have you anything you wanted to add?
To say there, that wasn't my decision making, that was Claire leading on that part. I just did the history and geography overview.
I think I had something very similar, which was dedicate. I think there are 2 options that you can go, which is to do something, as Victoria's mentioned, where you kind of give over lots of staff meeting time to kind of put these things into place, which absolutely right. I think that works well for some subjects, and some subjects I think it probably doesn't need. Obviously, you can do it, and it can work well. Whether you need to do that is another question completely. And I think certainly for some leaders, there kind of is a fetishization of bespokeness, and it's kind of this buzzword that gets thrown around for curriculum quite a lot. It needs to be bespoke to our school. I see no reason, like, you are not going to make a study of the Maya bespoke to your school if it is in central London. It's pointless. You might have a few you might be able to get some things in there, some local link perhaps to some Romans, but the vast majority of that is not going to be bespoke. You're not going to look at the Romans within a 2-mile radius of your school and what happened around there for a whole sequence of learning. So I think actually, when it comes to history, there is one curriculum objective where it talks about using the locality, and of course that one has to be bespoke to your locality, although you can get into a debate perhaps with the geographers about what locality means and how far you have to go from where you are before you go out of your locality, and whether you agree with it, whether you don't agree with it on a philosophical level. There are curricula out there that you can buy off the shelf, and as long as you kind of subscribe to or even if you don't subscribe to the kind of pedagogy that kind of the school that developed that as uses, something particularly of Reach Feltnam here and their history booklets that they've written, which are amazing. They're fantastic. Like it does 95% of the work for you. And I think there is that fetishization of bespoke curricula where it has to be, it has to be our stamp on it, and it needs to be us. And actually the amount of time that takes, depending on where your staff are, what their subject knowledge are. Let's get real here. We're all, especially now, we're all busy, we're all tired, we've all got lots of other things to worry about when we get back in. Kids are back. Just buy it and use it, and then just concentrate your time on that one unit where it is about your locality, and then obviously adapt it for that 5% where you might have a local link to something. But other than that, I think that's certainly something that I think, if you're a small school and you're worried about that, don't worry about it too much. Just use what's there. And that's just one thing that you can. I'm sure there are others. I think Christine Council's, I don't know if they're available to buy, but I saw that, Christine Council has written some curricular resources for, I think, Haringey in North London. So they may be available to purchase at a later date. So I'm not sure, but there are things out there, and I think school leaders, don't worry too much about that bespokeness. I'm not sure where that's come from, to be honest.
I was laughing to try and cover the look on my face when you're saying that. I agree to a point that there's no point reinventing the wheel. I don't know if I can go quite as far as saying just buy it personally, but even ours that we didn't write everything from scratch, just sort of magicking it up from our minds. Like we did draw on other resources. Like you don't have to write everything yourself from scratch. There's no point doing that. I definitely agree with that. And I mean, like some resources can be really good. We use some of the CGP history.
Yeah, no, actually, they're really good.
They've got really good sources in. The one I've used, the prehistory one, and it was so helpful. And if you can save time like that with those really high quality resources, then definitely go for it.
Yeah, because they do. I've got one down here. They do activity. This is a Rivers one, but they do. I don't know if you see it. I think they do activity books as well. And for schools, they a couple of quid, I think, for the actual booklet and the activity books. You would, maybe this is controversial Claxon here, but I think there are probably schools who are doing. You could get these for the kids, and these are the workbooks for the kids. And I think that might be better. That might be a better offer than what some schools are doing by trying to do it alone.
Lots of food for thought. Do you think it's possible for a curriculum to be over-ambitious in its aims?
Yes. But I would rather start from a place where I've been too ambitious and have to turn it down than not be ambitious enough to begin with and then have to ramp it up afterwards, is my kind of when I thought about that. And I think I've fallen guilty of some of the curricula that I've looked at. Again, it's that process of curriculum is never done. It's not just a document that's finished once you've put that last full stop in. I've looked back at some of the things that I've done and I thought probably would take that out now, or I wouldn't be upset in the slightest if a teacher thought, no, I don't need to worry about that bit too much. But I think it's easier to go too far and then cut back than to put a lot of work and then be like, oh, we didn't go far enough, so we need to ramp up the pressure a bit more.
That's interesting, actually, because I didn't initially think about being over-ambitious as in putting too much content in, but I think you could definitely do that. I'm sure I do that. But also I think you can, when I want to revise things, it's because I haven't been ambitious enough in a way, but not about the amount of content that I'm putting in, but just that maybe I think actually it's more about the disciplinary knowledge for me, that I learned something about those concepts, and I'm thinking, well, actually, no, although they're learning about that, I didn't include the comparison that there could have been, or I'd missed a link between some things. So I think for me, if I was revising things, I'd probably be making it more ambitious, but that doesn't necessarily mean adding more content in. It's just adjusting the way it's taught to teach it better. But see, when my initial thought about that was it can be too ambitious, but sometimes I think maybe people want to be ambitious, and so you can put content in that's just way above what the children can access without, and that doesn't mean that they can't understand like complex content, but if you don't actually plan the curriculum to enable them to understand it, and you just say, oh look, my year sixes are so great, they're studying this, as if just saying the title of the topic, like the content that they're learning, makes it better somehow. And it's not sort of approaching it from a point of view of doing it to look impressive, that look at what our year six are learning. It's that your curriculum has really supported their learning, so that when they get to year six, they are actually able to access and understand that content. So I was kind of thinking yes and no, that some of you can enable children to sort of do really impressive things, but you have to have actually put the work in to get the children to that point. There's no point in trying to get them to do something they don't really understand just to make it look ambitious. And then the other thing I thought of was also, I think some people want to challenge their children to the extent that they start teaching things from the secondary curriculum. We're not likely to do as good a job of teaching it as the specialists teaching it in secondary, and what's the point of them duplicating things? So I think there's a danger of that as well, that you have to really know what are they actually going to learn at secondary school in this subject, and make sure that you don't encroach too far into that. Because to be honest, like the bit of history that we have in primary that's sort of fixed that we have to cover is the ancient history, the prehistory, ancient history up to 1066. Well, I mean, there's so much in that. You could spend so long teaching that in primary and still not have taught everything that you might want them to know in that time period. So I don't know why you would then go into things that you know they're going to cover again in secondary.
See, that's really interesting, because in a unit that we do the history of medicine, which is taken like pretty much from I think I did it in GCSE, so I don't know if it's still in the GCSE spec.
I did that in GCSE, yeah.
And so I'd be interested if whenever we eventually get our year fives or year fours to do that, whether that's going to be beneficial to them, or the history teachers are going to be like, oh, this isn't helpful. But just to let people know who are listening, the justification for that was because I like to use thinking about curriculum history, curriculum design, I like to use kind of thematic units to kind of go back and look at the periods that they've already studied, but add kind of a new element to their schema. So we do the history of medicine, I think, towards the end of year four, where we go back, we look at, actually, medicine during the Stone Age, it was some herbs and like a witch doctor kind of thing, and a bit of trepanning, which is always an interesting one. And then we go to the Romans, and it's all about public health and things like that, which I think, and obviously you can connect that into the prior knowledge of Stone Age Romans, etc., etc., etc. And I think that works quite well. I never kind of really gave it much thought about whether that's something to leave to GCSE. And I'm kind of sure some things might be touched upon and some things won't be. So just from my knowledge, we do look at Galen and the Four Humors, but we certainly don't go to the role of the church in like controlling medicine or anything like that. We look at there were the Four Humors, and they just thought if they were out of balance, they'd put a leech on you if they thought they had more blood. A real kind of, I don't want to say simplistic, because I don't think it's a simplistic thing, but a real kind of surface level kind of idea of what the stuff is. And the hope is actually that they will remember, or not necessarily remember it, but it'll kind of be there in that kind of subconscious memory. And so when they come to do that, hopefully they take it at GCSE, and then they can go, oh yeah, I remember when we did A, B, C, D, and all those kinds of things. So yeah, I'd be interested. I never really thought of it from that, whether I'm poaching too much into secondary territory there.
I mean, we do have to do those thematic studies and then go later in, like that is part of the primary curriculum anyway, isn't it? Like there is that element of going later than 1066 with the thematic study and developing the sense of chronology. And I suppose it depends on how does it fit into the history curriculum as a whole, doesn't it? That if you do one thing that they might come back to later in secondary, it's not really a big issue, is it? It's quite good to prepare them for things they're going to learn later anyway. That's probably one of the functions of what we're trying to do, isn't it? Is to prepare them for what they're going to learn secondary. But if you maybe, and I guess it might be academies that could potentially fall into this trap if you want to use the not having to follow the national curriculum and deviate from it a little bit, that you could go too heavy on the after 1066 stuff. And then there's the danger that you're not actually teaching them the pre-1066. And then I just think that they're not going to get that again in secondary. And I know that I've seen some secondary teachers on Twitter saying that they're having to add in extra ancient history to their Key Stage 3.
Oh, interesting.
The children don't have enough knowledge of ancient Greece and Rome to be able to access their like later, what they've got planned for later. So they need to add that in to make sure that they're ready for it. And then I just think, well, if they're having to do that, then that's not right, really, is it? They've got enough to do in Key Stage 3 as it is without having to go back and reteach stuff in primary. So I feel like we should try and focus more on that the prehistory and ancient history, because I know like there's no way I was going to miss the ancient Greeks, even though we've had to like change the curriculum around a little bit because of lockdowns and things. That's the only time they're going to learn about ancient Greece, and it's really important. So you have to really make sure that they've done that really well in primary, because they're not going to get it again unless they go on to later classic study.
Like I didn't have a preconceived answer in mind, but I knew that asking you guys would be really interesting, and it absolutely was. And I think what it did, it almost illuminated the connections between the different decisions you're making, almost semi-automatically at the minute. Yeah, so I think that's really interesting. And is there any final piece of advice you would give to anyone, like last time they were feeling energized about their geography practice? Anyone who's buzzing to get in there with history, what would your final piece of advice be?
Mine were very, very similar to what I said for geography. I hope my passion for teaching history has come across in this, and so I am exceptionally willing to chat to anyone who wants to talk about primary history curriculum whatsoever at any point. I really do enjoy it. Pester SLT for that membership for the HA. Make sure you get those magazines, listen to those webinars on What's the Wisdom. Just that reminder, it's a marathon, not a sprint. Curriculum is never done. Just because you've written your first one, it's far from over. You're not going to see the benefits of it until kind of that first year, that year one of that first year of implementation, kind of get through to year 6. And all the time there needs to be that amendment. If you are on Twitter, then I certainly recommend you follow Christine Council, Michael Fordham, Mike Hill, Stuart Tiffany, who is a primary history specialist, and Ben Newmark. All the others are secondary based, but they've all been really, really helpful in my thinking, and have always kind of been willing to help me out whenever I've asked questions.
Yeah, I mean, the only thing I'd probably add is the local thing again. I kind of already mentioned it earlier, but just trying to learn a lot about your local history, local to your school. Try and visit all of the possible places, and just really enjoy learning about history. I think the more that you research things, the more interested you're going to become. So just really giving a little bit of time to developing your own subject knowledge, make it more enjoyable, although possibly more frustrating, because there's so much stuff that I'm interested in. I want to teach all of it to the children, so I end up getting frustrated that I can't do that. But I think just try and find those sort of interests, make sure that you're really interested, and then the passion will come across when you're teaching.
Yeah, and I think if you're not interested, fake that interest.
I think you can become interested. You think you're not interested because you haven't found out the right things yet, is what I think. I probably hadn't really thought about RE at all until I became RE subject lead. And I didn't really know much about other religions at all. And as soon as I started finding out more about it, I just found it so interesting. And I think you can develop an interest in subjects yourself by starting to research and looking for the things that are interesting. You maybe just haven't found out the right things yet to interest you.
Yeah. That's quite a common one with maths teachers or primary maths specialists. They'll often say, like I know Lisa said in her episode that she was big into literature when she was younger, and then she got the of her maths, and then that was her gone. Now she hasn't looked back. So yeah, I think that's 100% the way to go. And I think if Neil, you just tell everybody what you're reading, as you change books, because I know that my understanding of antiquity has improved just by sort of following your recommendations.
Map of Knowledge is a wonderful, fantastic book on history. If people wanted a real kind of meaty history book to read, it follows the story of kind of Galen's medical curriculum, Ptolemy's the alchemist, and Euclid's work in geometry in the, help me out here, Kieran, because it's gone again.
The Elements.
The Elements, thank you very much. And how kind of when they were written and how they might have been lost and all the translations that they went through, and it kind of follows them around seven cities, which it's very good, and clearly I need to go back and revisit and commit it more to my long-term memory. There's a few things that I think Victoria brought up, and it's quite important as well. RE, there's very important that when we teach RE, we do stick to the religious element of RE, obviously, but at the same time there is a political element, especially when it comes to Christianity and looking at Protestantism and Catholicism and the schism that happened there. So for example, we do teach the Tudors in year 5 or year 6, being an academy. And so I think for us, if you're doing that, you're using those freedoms where you can link your RE to your history as well, so that right, if they're doing the Tudors and they're focusing on religious change, then you want them to be really secure in understanding what the differences between Protestantism and Catholicism is, because it just gives it much more of a meaningful it just makes it much more meaningful for them. Likewise, I see some schools who do they focus on like Guy Fawkes in year 2, I think. And obviously you can do that. I'm not saying don't do it in year 2. But just think about, when you think about choice, everything's a choice. There's an opportunity cost to everything. If they have that understanding of the differences between between Catholicism and Protestantism first, then I think they're going to get a lot more out of that. I think so. Where you can, see if you can get those links going together as well.
That leaves us with one thing to do, and that is the tier list. Originally, I had the 7 cities, but then Neil and I were discussing and thinking that might be too niche, especially if you haven't read the Map of Knowledge, Victoria. So this one's just going to be for you, and it's going to be the curriculum content that Neil took on in episode 3 of season 1, just to see where the similarities and differences are. So Jack Harker also took this on, and his was quite similar to Neil's. So let me see if I could share my screen. Just like last time, S is stellar, A is very, very good, B is average, and C is below average. And I suppose it's the relevance, how important do you think they are in the curriculum? What sort of credence do you give them when you come across them? And so the first one is dinosaurs.
I liked it better last time when we were discussing them. Pressure now.
Well, no, there's no wrong answer. Just your. You can discuss out loud what you're thinking if you, as most people do to find when they don't have an accompanying guest with them.
I'm trying to second guess what Neil thought. That's my problem. I mean, obviously, it's not actually in the national curriculum to learn about dinosaurs. This is why I know that Neil disagrees with me, I think, but I would mention them when I'm looking at the timeline of prehistory. You said no, didn't you? But I think I would, just because the children know about dinosaurs. Like, I think it's something that they know about that you can kind of link it to, but then you have to do it in a way that they're understanding the huge lengths of time. And like, I'm just saying what Neil's going to say as well. Like, I'm just saying it for both of us anyway. But like, you're going to say that they can't ever understand those lengths of time because they're so huge, and I'm going to say I think they can. But I think if you do it, if you kind of link it to dinosaurs, but try and use some sort of scale to show the comparative lengths of time, that could be useful. I wouldn't actually teach dinosaurs explicitly. I might just do one lesson on timeline of history of the Earth and include it in that. So I don't know if that makes it B or C, really. Like, it's not important as in you would teach a unit on it, but I would probably mention it as part of that history.
I don't think you're as far apart as you might imagine. Yeah, Neil put it in C because for pretty much the same reasons. You know, because I think what I was trying to do was I was trying to coax Neil with them what is essentially people using whole terms to teach the dinosaurs.
Yeah,
and whether or not that's right. I think it's both from both of you talking. It's pretty clear, and Jack as well, that that's not something we should be dedicating 6 weeks of our time to. So yeah, so I think
But I agree with Victoria. Like, if you were doing a massive, timeline like that, I'd no qualm in putting that in there at all. But so I wouldn't spend 6 weeks.
No.
And then only 5 of your lessons are on dinosaurs, and only one lesson then on the changes of between the Stone Age through to the Iron Age.
No, I think it's worth linking it just because children often know a lot about the dinosaurs and they link lengths of time. Like, a lot of them know the 65 million years ago, like that type of thing. So I think that's quite a good way of linking the time scale of the history of the Earth. Like, when I taught Stone Age to Iron Age, did a huge timeline in the hall, starting from the Big Bang and going all the way along to now, and tried to do it in scale. And I spent ages on the floor in the hall rolling out toilet roll on my knees, crawling around the hall. But that was great. So like including it briefly in something like that, fine. But actually, as a topic, no.
Nice. So then the next one is pirates.
Depends which area of the curriculum we're talking about.
I think perhaps from a historical perspective, I reckon.
I don't know, somewhere in the middle. It's not one that I would say definitely, yes, everyone should do this. But there are, if you do it in a properly historical way, like Neil wrote in his blog, rather than you're not just doing some fun activities on pirates and mentioning a few pirates from the past and then saying that's history. But if it's a properly researched historical unit of work, then depending on how it fits in your curriculum, then there can definitely be value to it. It's not something I would say everyone definitely should do. And I think there's a potential for it to drift off the history, maybe, depending on how you plan it and how the planning's disseminated to the teachers as well. So I don't know, B.
So it's somewhere in the middle. Neil, did you go S with yours? Because I know you're a big fan.
I think I went quite low, actually. I think I went B or A because I do enjoy the unit that I created. But if I to have full control. Would I probably do it with year 2? There might be a few more things that I think are a bit more, when we think about Young's concepts, powerful knowledge. I think it's very interesting, don't get me wrong, but I think, there are more powerful things that children in year 2 can do, I think. But there are some lovely, and again, it depends, as Victoria said, how it's done. It can be done well, but I think it's quite an easy one to be done badly as well. So I think I put it in B or A, I think.
I quite like it as an English. I like English around pirates. I can see more. I quite like that. There's loads of great books of pirates in.
Nice, great justification so far. Then we've got the Stone Age.
Well, that one's easier because you have to teach that. So that one's got to be S, I suppose.
When would you teach it, Victoria?
I'm not going to change my answer however many times you ask me.
I think we can, when this goes out, Kieran, there can be a poll attached to it. Would you teach the Stone Age to Iron Age in, I'm a Puritan, I'm very much, I'm for it for year 3. I think, Victoria, you're year 6, aren't you, or year 5?
6.
So,
yeah. You can read my blog for detailed reasoning. But I mean, I'm not saying, obviously it can be taught in year 3, and that's fine. You could 4 or 5, to be honest. But I just think, to me, the ideal place is 6, just because of the links to. I think you can just get a lot more out of it if you do it in 6. I'm sure that children can understand if you just take the history of the Stone Age in isolation, that they can understand that in year 3. Although our year 3s have just done it and did find it quite tricky. Whereas I did it in year 5 and we absolutely loved it and it was great. So I think it's better in upper key stage 2. And I think then the science on evolution in year 6 and just looking at that whole, how I just add in a little bit on how Earth has changed over time and if they've already learned about space and just this. I think there's so many links that you can make that just make it fit more in. It goes back to the chronology again, the narrative. I just think you can make it fit and make sense more if you teach it there, even if you're then going back and teaching something later in the key stage. But then that's a whole different debate about whether you need to teach chronologically to get chronological understanding.
Oh, that could be an episode on its own.
Yeah.
Let's fire up a sequence of polls with the blogs. And have you written a counter argument, Neil, that we could share at the same time?
I said I would, but I never got around to it. So this might be the.
So there you go. You've got a term to hash that out.
Yeah.
So I think the next one then is the Tudor period, represented here by Henry Tudor, Henry VII.
Well, that's a tricky one. That's tricky because I think I learned about the Tudors about 5 times throughout my time at school. I ended up doing it so much, but I really love the Tudors. It's one of my favourite periods of history. So if it was just down to my opinion, I would want to do it.
Well, it is. It absolutely is in this context. It is absolutely your opinion. So
that's just sort of my emotional response rather than my opinion on how important it is. Might be different to if I was given a choice. I'd want to teach that because I like it and I know a lot about it, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's important. I might go somewhere between A and B.
I think that might be our first significant difference. Neil, did you have it in S because of the significance of the changes?
Yeah, I think when you think of the Tudor dynasty as a whole, I think there's not been a dynasty where more kind of societal change has happened that's impacted on what the world the UK looks like right now. And so I think for them, I put them up quite high.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'm thinking about in primary, how important is it? So overall, I I agree it's really important for children to learn about it. It's maybe just where.
I think, we do it in year 6. I think that's the right time to do it. Don't think I'd want to do that earlier. But again, that's where academy and academy freedoms.
Yeah, and I'm just like national curriculum literal person.
Yeah. But like I said, it's totally subjective, and just really interesting to listen to you both talk about it. So the penultimate is ancient Greece.
That one's going to be S as well.
And it's been mentioned quite a few times today as well, hasn't it? Yeah, so I thought
that's one that frustrates me, because I just think that there's just so much. When you look at the description of, I can't remember the exact wording of the bullet point, but it's about like the influence of the ancient Greeks on like our life today. And when you actually look at the amount of stuff that you could include in that, and it's impossible to teach it, even in the time that we do have. I just think I'd like it if you could break it down into do like 3 different units on different aspects of ancient Greece. There's just so much that you could look at in that one topic.
Yeah. And then the last one is a bit of a different one. It's the idea of teaching history through a significant figure. For instance, in this case, an artist.
That's tricky, because I guess it depends exactly how it's done.
Yeah, I think that's been the distinguishing factor that everyone's mentioned is, it could be done really well, but actually, what are the chances of it being done really well? I think that's where people usually land.
Yeah, and I think, like I was saying earlier, I think it's definitely valuable to include, to sort of link artists and authors and composers to other historical learning. But would I necessarily spend a whole term teaching a unit on that? Possibly in Key Stage 1, that can be more. It depends on exactly who the figure is as well, doesn't it? In Key Stage 1, I guess that could be more viable.
Where would you like to put them?
Maybe go for B again, on the level of pirates. But I think there could be really, really good units based on that I might then place higher up, that might convince me.
Excellent. But we're under no doubt that Stone Age and ancient Greece are S-tier topics. And then we've got the Tudors sort of straddling good and average, pirates and through significant figures, and then the poor old dinosaurs. I wonder what it is about dinosaurs that every kid knows all about them. It must be really strong branding, on the part of toy companies, because some of the, like you said, Neil, before, the polysyllabic names that kids know of these dinosaurs, and before they can even decode CVC words, it's
also Velociraptor without a.
Yeah, Teen Dinosaur, strong branding game. Awesome. It's been an absolute pleasure, guys. I think people will get so much from both episodes. I think all I have to say is thank you very much, and hopefully we'll see you again very, very soon.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for having me.